You're listening to Milwaukee Mafia, your podcast dose of Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Milwaukee Mafia podcast. I'm Eric.
I'm Gavin.
Did you like my long, drawn-out introduction? I felt like that was way longer than it normally is.
Is it?
I don't know.
Oh.
Maybe. Maybe not.
Maybe. I don't know.
So, we're here in the middle of the afternoon, which is something we never do.
Yeah, so I'm only like 3/4 awake today.
So, he's going to be mumbling and talking really slowly.
I'll be fine, but I haven't had my coffee yet today. Yeah, so we're here with Milwaukee Mafia, and so I don't know if you remember last time or not, but we were kind of leading into Frank Balestrieri's tax case.
Yes.
We're not going to talk about that.
Wasn't quite the right timeline, huh?
No, so we'll get there. I checked the timeline, and there's a couple things we're going to do first, because if I put it in now, then I have to go farther ahead. It's easier to do it later and then kind of backtrack, because it is stretched out so long.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not quite yet.
Okay.
And in fact, we're going to abandon the timeline completely this week. On top of that.
Wow.
Because since last time we sat down, I got a message from a guy, and he was like, hey, you got this thing on your website about this murder that happened, and that was my grandfather. Do you have any more information about that? And I thought, well, no, but it's a good opportunity to kind of take a peek. So I went back, I polished up what I had. I sent out some emails to a sheriff's department, a coroner's office, seeing what I could get. So we're totally going off the path today. And we're going to go to a 1932.
Wow. So you just kind of skipped right over this story prior to this, huh?
Yeah. Well, see, the thing of it is this is more of a Kenosha story.
Oh, okay.
That's why we skipped it, because on this podcast, we didn't do anything with Kenosha or Madison or any of that. We just completely ignored that, like it doesn't exist. But we're gonna actually go back and do a little bit of Kenosha today.
So I'm curious, because did this person tell you how they stumbled upon this? Did they just Google their grandfather's name and your website came up, or were they literally like sitting and perusing the FBI files on your website?
No, I don't think it was like that. They didn't tell me, but my guess is it was more the Google search. Yeah. So specifically, they were interested in the fact that I said that there were photos taken, which I don't have those photos. But that was what the newspaper article said, was that the photos were taken. Mm-hmm. They probably don't exist anymore, because I will tell you, the sheriff's department was very helpful, but ultimately they determined that file is very, very destroyed. So
they tried. They tried, but they're like, it's not here.
They tried, but I knew that going in that was kind of a long shot, because this is 90 years ago. This is a really old case, so they have no reason to hang on to that. But anyway, so you want to get into it?
Yeah, go for it, man.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit about a guy named Victor Dominic.
Okay,
and Victor Dominic. Is actually, his birth name is Vito Damiani, but he went by Victor Dominic because it sounds more American, I guess. He's kind of a Racine, Kenosha area guy. We're gonna jump ahead from his being born up to 1932. Okay. So we don't care about him being born.
Before you jump ahead, I'm just curious. Now, I think we discussed this on a previous podcast, but I want to clarify the Racine and Kenosha thing. They were pretty separate from Milwaukee, right?
Yes.
So there's not like a ton of overlap with
Racine a little bit, Kenosha pretty much not at all. Yeah.
Okay. What about between Kenosha and Racine? Because that seems like there would be a lot of overlap, but were they
between the two of them?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, that's kind of the weird thing, is like there is some overlap between Milwaukee and Racine, and there is some overlap between Racine and Kenosha. But like Milwaukee and Kenosha,
nothing.
You pretty much aren't going to find a story there. It's just
that is interesting.
It is. It's kind of strange, and I don't entirely understand it, but that seems to be the case.
The point being is that you are not going to recognize any of the names probably that you hear in this story.
Correct.
Because there's just no overlap.
Correct.
So
The people in this story will come up dozens of times in the Kenosha story, but we didn't do the Kenosha story. So, yeah. Okay. So 1932, we've got Robert A. Wilson, who is a realtor, a real estate man. He drives from Kenosha to Madison to Lodi with former roommate Frank Tillius, and he was met at land in Lodi with 3 other people on August 24th, 1932. Wilson met with the men on schedule who claimed they were looking for farmland where they wanted to build a still for cooking alcohol.
And is this in Prohibition times?
This is like the very tail end.
Okay, so they could say that, but at this point, because nobody was enforcing it anyways.
Pretty much,
Okay.
yeah. He brought them on the farms of Ener Larson, Charles Knutson, who were the neighboring farmers. He said, hey, just so you guys know, these men might be your future neighbors. The men ate a melon from Knutson's field. They said, that's a very good melon. This is good farmland. Before the day was out, Wilson was strangled with gauze or cheesecloth and forced to sign 2 notes with a value of $40,000. So he signed over, I don't know exactly what a note is, but like a check, basically. Wilson was then hit in the head with a club, and his face was pushed into the sandy soil. His body was dumped on his own property. Following his murder, the men drove back in 2 vehicles. Wilson's vehicle, and also, allegedly, in William Cavelli's vehicle. And William Cavelli, known as Red Cavelli, was basically the equivalent of the mob boss in Kenosha. I don't know what they called that. I don't think they call it mob boss, but he was their version of that.
Right.
Yeah.
So was the Kenosha mob just kind of not really recognized as a mob per se? Or?
Yeah, so the thing is, in Milwaukee, because Milwaukee was largely Sicilian, they were Mafia.
Mm-hmm.
And in Kenosha, they were Calabrian, which is like southern Italy, but not the island of Sicily. And so they had very similar criminal organization, but not strictly speaking a mafia. So I'm not really familiar with the terminology that they would use for that. For our purposes, they're basically the same thing.
I'm just curious, the term mafia, is that an Italian term?
It's a Sicilian term originally.
Okay,
yeah.
so basically it's the same thing, but they probably just had a different term than mafia for it in their whatever area of Italy or whatever.
Right.
Okay, follow.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know what all, like way back in the very first or second episode of this podcast, we talked about the structure and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the structure is in other parts of Italy, but I assume they're relatively similar.
Yeah.
Okay. A few days later, the neighbor, Alfred Larson, was tending to his cows around dusk. There was no fence between his farm and Wilson's property, so the cows sometimes just would graze freely. One cow was on the Wilson land, and Larson was drawn over by the cow's bell, where he found an unusual mound of earth surrounded by trees with what looked like a man's shoulder coming out of the dirt. Early the next morning he returned, because it was dusk, it was dark. Early the next morning he returned, and yep, they saw a partially decomposed man in the sand. They called the sheriff, and the sheriff brought along the district attorney, and of course we know from the story that it's Robert Wilson. His face was too decomposed to be identified after just being there about a week. So he was identified by the belt buckle that he wore, which had a W on it. So we knew it was Wilson because he had a Wilson belt buckle. Yeah.
It wasn't allowed to sell a Wilson belt buckle to anybody else.
Right. A doctor was called. I presume this doctor is like the coroner. I mean, the doctor's not going to do much for this guy. And photographs were taken, as I said, as the body was unearthed. As far as I know, those photos are probably long gone. The coroner declared the death came not from the hits on the head, but from suffocating in the ground. I'm not sure exactly how he determined this, but apparently his conclusion was that he was probably unconscious when he was pushed into the ground and then ended up suffocating.
He was essentially buried alive.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Yes. Pretty rough. Somehow, authorities were able to get some identities of who the suspects were, and they rounded up Frank Tilius, Red Cavelli, Frank Infacino, and Frank Cosentino, arrested them, brought them by train to the Portage jail, Portage, the city, which is like in Columbia County, for people who don't know the geography here. This was due in part to Tilius trying to cash those forged notes, which, despite being dated a couple of years prior, were found to have been freshly signed, which seems suspicious. Tilius said his only role in the plot was to cash the notes. He didn't kill anybody, but the police believe that he was well aware of the intent to kill Wilson, whether he personally did so or not. Police found over $800 in Cavelli's pockets, as well as receipts for his stepdaughter's wedding, showing the purchase of a new car, and rental agreements for a Chicago orchestra worth $1,500 and the largest reception hall in Kenosha, which, again, this is the 1930s. $1,500 for a wedding band. Holy crap.
Well, and just the fact that, didn't you say he had $800 in his pocket?
Yeah.
I mean, that would probably be what, carrying around $3,000 in your pocket right now?
Yeah, it would be quite a lot. He had also sent his two sons to a royal academy in Italy, and police were very curious how a man whose day job was running a bakery was able to afford such luxury. Yeah. Frank Tilius was a divorced Lithuanian immigrant. Frank Tilius was a divorced Lithuanian immigrant. His ex-wife Mary was able to get a divorce after saying he tried to drown her in a lake while they were fishing. So he's not necessarily a nice guy either. Yeah. He actually confesses, and he names the other guys. Yep, he's like, they were part of the plot. So he's then separated from the others. He's taken out of Portage, and he's brought to Wisconsin Dells, the water park capital of the world.
And I'm sure it was at this time too, right?
No, it was not the water park capital of the world yet. But he's brought to a separate jail, so he doesn't have to be in jail with these other guys who he just ratted out. He says, I'm glad you separated me. Tilius tells the sheriff, they said they would crack my head with handcuffs. They told me they'd kill me, like they finished Robert Wilson in the woods. I don't know if this is actually what he said, but that's what the paper says he said. The plan of separating him from the others did not work. That night, Tilius committed suicide in Wisconsin Dells jail.
Well, I mean, that one's kind of out of their control.
Yeah,
to be fair.
Yeah. He hung his neck by his belt and tied his hands behind his back with a handkerchief and was found dangling around 4 a.m. by the jail guard. The jail guard, to his credit, did make rounds every 40 minutes, but apparently, you just wait for him to go by, and then you got 40 minutes. So they weren't able to catch him in time. Hearing of Tilius's death, Red Cavelli told the press, "That's a good thing." Strange comment, but he says, "That's a good thing." Frank Cosentino told the press, "He was crazy anyway." Yeah, I don't know. Police were looking for Victor Dominic of Racine, who I mentioned at the very beginning.
Yeah.
He was placed under arrest in Sacramento, California.
Wow, he really ran, huh?
Yeah, he was nowhere around. Allegedly, he had fled to Sacramento the day after the murder. He was also there to visit his brother Thomas Dominic, who was in the Sacramento jail for forging federal notes. So apparently forging notes is a thing. Victor Dominic had as his alibi a railroad ticket that he had purchased to travel from Wisconsin to California. The ticket was purchased on August 16th, which was before the murder. Now, police were not so quick to give up. They said, well, it's possible you bought the ticket on August 16th, but maybe you didn't use the ticket until after. I'm not sure how they don't know this, but apparently they just had the purchase date.
And it's kind of weird that, I guess maybe that's just the way train tickets work there, where you just bought it and you could use it whenever you felt like it.
I'm guessing because, they weren't able to tell when it was actually used. Mm-hmm. Okay. On September 16th, just in time for Red Cavelli's stepdaughter's marriage, he was released along with Frank Cosentino and Frank Infacino. They were released from jail. The district attorney decided that without Frank Tillius, who had committed suicide, there was not enough evidence to hold the men, and the local justice of the peace agreed. None of the neighbors, farmers, whatever, up on the Lodi land had seen these men. They had only seen Frank Tillius and Victor Dominic, so no matter what, there was nothing actually connecting these guys to the crime other than Frank Tillius saying they had been there, and that isn't going to do any good if he's not around to testify. The three men returned home to cheering friends and relatives. Infacino was dropped off in Racine, and the other two were paraded in by a caravan of well-wishers and were met by more friends along with Covelli's wife when they reached Covelli's house. So many people wanted to follow Covelli home that a police escort was necessary to handle the traffic. Hundreds of people packed his house, and telegrams had arrived from far away. Louis Grieco ducked out early to work on wedding plans with Covelli's stepdaughter. Louis Grieco was going to be his new son-in-law. Whether this guy was involved in the murder or not, he apparently has a lot of friends. Victor Dominic was still wanted, but he was in California, so they had to extradite him. His attorneys said, hey, we're willing to do a lie detector test and, show you that he didn't do it. The district attorney thought this was a good idea. The sheriff said, I don't think that's necessary. A couple of days later, the California governor, Sonny Jim, that's what the
governor's name is. Huh?
His name is James Rolfe, but he went by Sonny Jim, refused to sign the extradition papers, saying that he believed that Dominic was in California at the time of the murder. The district attorney spoke to the press, upset about the disobedience of the sheriff. He said, gosh darn it, I wanted him to take that lie detector test, and the sheriff didn't go for it, and I bet if he would have taken that test, things would have been different. But because he didn't take that test, we had nothing to show for it other than that questionable railroad ticket, so they couldn't extradite him. A few days later, still, Josephine Roth, who is allegedly the girlfriend of Frank Tillius, the suicide man, she was arrested and held on $2,500 bond for her part in the murder of Robert Wilson. Now, she was not anywhere near the murder, but when she was arrested, she said, I'm completely innocent of this. I wasn't Tillius's girlfriend, like you said. I never lived with him, like you said. Since the very beginning of time, women have been blamed for men's problems. She says, just look at Adam and Eve. Everyone's always blaming Eve. It's like, why are women always getting the blame? The newspaper, as was normal at the time, noted she was very pretty for a woman who was 38 years old. Even though she was an ancient 38, she looked pretty good. Don't know what that has to do with whether she's guilty or not, but thanks, newspaper.
Oh.
She told everybody she didn't want to be held in jail because she had a 15-year-old son and would rather be home with him. Now, what they had accused her of was not anything to do with the murder specifically, but she was apparently the one who had forged some of these notes and had gotten them cashed. So after the fact, she was involved, allegedly, with getting this money that they weren't supposed to get out of this guy. So she possibly didn't even know he was killed. I have to assume that she would have known, but maybe not.
Just out of curiosity, and maybe I missed this, is this the purpose behind this murder, is they wanted these notes?
It seems that way.
Or
because
is there something more to this?
It would seem like they were trying to get the land.
Okay.
But they'd made no effort to get the land.
And as well, if you're going to kill somebody for their land, does it make sense to bury their body on the land?
Not necessarily.
I don't know. I'm not a mastermind criminal, but I'd probably pick a different location for it.
I mean, maybe they were going to come back later and move him. I don't know. But yeah, but all they apparently got out of him was a couple forced signatures to sign over money that, they had no reason to have. So, yeah, I don't know. She went on trial, and they called in a handwriting expert, and they said, yep, this is your handwriting on these notes. He said, look at this, I can match this up, even though the dates don't match, it says it's from 2 years ago, but the ink is still fresh, so we know that they were written recently. And, long story short, they end up convincing the jury that she is, in fact, guilty of her involvement in forging these notes that got signed.
Okay. But that's all she got charged with is forging signatures, not anything to do with an actual murder.
Not the murder specifically.
Okay.
No. So she ends up getting sentenced to 6 months in jail. This is very important that she's in jail for the 6 months. Victor Dominic finally returns to Racine, not because he's extradited, but because he lives in Racine. So he eventually does return many months later. And they arrest him when he returns because, they still want him. So they pick him up. His preliminary hearing was held in December 1932, so like several months later. He was charged with being part of the Wilson murder plot, but he claimed to have an alibi. He's like, again, I was in California. Witnesses said that they saw him with Frank Tillius and Wilson around the time of the murder. So there's a number of people saying, like, you weren't in California. You were here. We saw you. They'd show up, the witnesses would show up, tell their story. They'd ask Dominic to stand up, and then they would say, yep, that's the guy. So they had people. But the defense attorneys were very good. They had more than 20 affidavits saying Dominic was in California, and he was regularly visiting his brother Thomas in the Sacramento jail. Because he was regularly visiting him, he had to sign in repeatedly. So they knew what dates and times he was in and out of the jail.
So they actually had dates and times right around the murder that he was there?
Yes.
I guess at this time you could probably just pay somebody off to get that kind of information, but that seems pretty good. Reasonable that he wasn't in Kenosha at this time, right?
Yeah.
So
again, they talked about the train ticket, not a plane ticket, train ticket. They said, we said it was purchased. We don't know when you used it, but it definitely seems likely that, maybe you did use it early because you had the train took 2 to 3 days to get there. So it's like, okay, if you were there in time to sign in to the jail, I guess you had to be there a couple of days earlier. All right. And after all of this, and they also found a hotel register that he had signed while he was there. So all these things come together. They said, okay, you have a pretty strong alibi here. And eventually the judge said, I'm not going to end up putting you on trial. I'm going to release you. So after spending about 2 to 3 weeks in the Kenosha jail, he is released and said, go home. Go home. You're fine. So ultimately, Josephine Roth is the only one connected to this case that served any time. Other than the little bit of jail time they got while they were waiting for trials, she's the only one who actually got anything.
Convicted of anything?
Yeah.
That is really ridiculous because based on the information that you presented, they knew that these people also had these notes, and these notes came from Robert Wilson, that these people had notes.
But they didn't have the notes. They just had the cash.
Yeah, they had the cash, and her signature was on all the notes.
Yeah.
Almost kind of makes you think, like, was she a pawn in this? Like, were they using her? Like,
well, they definitely were. Whether it was, like, mean-spirited or not, that's definitely the part that she played because she's the only one who's directly involved. Once the notes turn into cash, can't prove where cash came from.
No.
So
it's just impossible. And
yeah. So, personally, I suspect these guys were probably involved. I'm even really, I don't know how Victor Dominic would have pulled it off, but, it seems like with everybody said that he was the guy they saw, that he would be the guy. But that's a pretty strong defense he's got there. Yeah,
and that's really tough because maybe Victor Dominic hung out with these other guys all the time. Mm-hmm. So everybody's just like, well, yeah, of course they were together. They were always together. But they weren't together that day because he was in California.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like he's got way too much stuff that, he couldn't just go out and fake all that. The hotel, the bus, the prison check-ins.
If he did,
he'd be very clever.
He'd be very clever because I don't think that's impossible to have somebody sign in under your name at the jail or at the hotel.
That's true.
But you would have to plan this all in advance.
Yeah.
Being like, just in case they check up on me.
Yeah.
Which, so it's not, I don't think it's impossible that it was him, but it is a pretty strong defense there. So, yeah, all these guys got away with it. And again, like I said, the grandson or great-grandson of Robert Wilson shot me an email, and he just wanted to kind of know more, and understandably so, because it's got to be frustrating when your grandfather is murdered and basically nothing was done about it.
Nothing was done about it. And I mean, based on what I've heard, there's not a real clear motive to committing the murder, because if it was just all about these notes, man, just go steal the notes, or... Right.
I mean, that appears to be the case, is that they knew that he had money, he had land, and they wanted his money. But yeah, I agree with you. There's got to be an easier way to go about getting money.
Yeah. It seems like a very not well thought out crime by the criminals, which...
Right.
But
they pulled it off.
They pulled it off, and which also leads you to talk about, like, this Victor Dominic, right? Was that his name?
Yeah.
I mean, if he was this unclever about pulling off a crime, there's no way he planted all these different things to protect himself from it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because he's just not that smart. So,
well, yeah, I don't know.
It's interesting.
But anyway, yeah, so I wanted to throw that out there. Like I said, it's not anywhere in our timeline, but because it came up, so I was kind of like looking into it this last week. I was like, I may as well use that for the show. But yeah, these guys, if you're interested in the Kenosha stuff, I mean, Red Covelli, regular, like all the time shows up, and his son will actually show up in our timeline. So he'll come back. Frank Cosentino shows up, not in ours, but Kenosha regular, Frank Infacino. Victor Dominic shows up in Kenosha a little bit after this because he ends up getting caught for like a big bootlegging conspiracy, which is, pretty normal. And then he flees. He leaves the area after that.
And Robert Wilson is in no way attached to any of this stuff. He was just a random victim.
Just a random victim, yeah. Like, he is, as far as I know, completely honest, member of the community, good businessman, and he just was dealing with the wrong guys.
Nice. Interesting. So this brings up a question, and maybe I've asked this question on this podcast before. So
sure.
But since you just stemmed off into a Kenosha story,
yeah,
is there a possibility of us doing like a 4-part series on Kenosha, 4-part series on Racine and different mafias within Wisconsin at some point in time?
We could.
Or
I'm not opposed to that. Yeah,
I think that would be a good idea, because I think we should give attention to every thing.
Yeah.
And if they don't have their own dedicated podcast, this is probably the best podcast for them to be on.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, if people are interested in the Madison stuff, I mean, I do have a book called Murder Capital, which you can check out.
Selfless plug, right?
Yeah, selfless plug. But you can check that out, and that would cover basically, the vast majority of the stuff that we would talk about on here. I've never written on Kenosha other than what's on the website. So there is no book for that. And people have asked if there's ever going to be a book. I don't know, maybe. It's tough. It's one of those things where, like, I want to go far enough back in history, as we've talked about many times, because I like to avoid a direct connection to living people. But if you go too far back, then you run into the problem like I had here, where the police record is destroyed. So you want that happy medium where it's old enough that they'll give you the record, but not so old that they threw it away.
Oh, the challenges of being a true crime researcher.
Yeah, I know. Well, and the problem is, I mean, if it's a crime that's actually been solved, like most murders, I mean, then the record's public. So it can be like 5 years old, and it's fine. But unfortunately, with mob stuff, they're almost never solved. So they remain technically open cases forever.
I have something to talk about, and which is probably completely not relevant for this podcast, but it might be interesting to people that listen to this podcast, since we are a true crime podcast.
Yeah.
But Gavin, have you ever listened to the podcast Serial?
I don't recall. I'm familiar with the story.
Well, the guy that is featured in the first season of Serial, to anybody who hasn't listened to this podcast, it's about a guy that committed a murder when he was in high school, got sent to jail, And to this day, he attests that he did not commit the murder.
Was it this guy's name was like Victor Adnan or something like that?
Saeed Adnan.
Saeed Adnan. I got Victor on the
something
brain.
like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think I did catch that.
But he finally just got a new trial and is for the first time in I think 23 years out of prison for this murder. He's out of prison for 30 days before while the prosecutors can decide if they're going to try him again for the murder or if they're just going to let him go. So I saw that in the news. I thought it was interesting, and somebody on this podcast might have listened to that podcast and did not see that on the news. And
I didn't hear about that. So
yeah,
there you go.
So way off topic, but
it is way off topic. But no, that's big. Anybody who's into, I'm surprised I hadn't heard that because that's a very celebrated case.
Yes. So I thought that was interesting. So, not to steal away from the Robert Wilson story, but I just thought that was very valid to talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe we'll touch back on the Kenosha scene again, because...
It's possible.
It's
possible.
And sorry
Or maybe I can just work it in when they start showing up in the Milwaukee story. I don't know. We'll see.
And I just got to say that unfortunately for... What was it? The great-grandson of Robert Wilson? I think he's
a great-grandson, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that this history is probably is a lot less than he wanted to hear about it, but at least he now knows at least some of the story and
I'm still waiting to hear back from the coroner, but my guess is even if they do have something, it's not going to add
very much to it. So I just think it's really tragic and I almost hope they're wrong in that he did die from being hit on the head.
Oh, yeah.
Because, can you envision just being buried alive? How terrible that would be. I don't know, though.
Pretty terrible. I mean, and I don't know how accurate that is. If he's partially decomposed, I'm not sure how you would determine. Not that I know. I mean, I don't do autopsies, but I feel like it's hard to really pinpoint things when you're only have parts of bodies.
And when it's 1932 and the technology they had there, how they would derive that is could very well be extremely inaccurate.
Yeah,
so
could be.
So, but it was a good story.
Yeah.
And Gavin, you want to hit them with contact info so we start doing that again?
Yeah, sure. You can email MilwaukeeMafia@gmail.com. You can go to MilwaukeeMafia.com to check out all the stuff I put up on the website, including the actual raw FBI files if you're into that. And or you can find me on Facebook. It's my least favorite of the three, but it seems to be the one that most people use. So you can message me on there. Facebook has a tendency to bury messages to if you send it to like my personal account, like I get it immediately. If you send it to my author account, for whatever reason, I don't always get notifications, so there's like an automatic thing that responds to people on there. But I would find it eventually. So.
Yes. There is a certain art to finding your Facebook page notifications.
Yeah.
So it's not Gavin ignoring you, it's just the shortcomings of the Facebook
I don't do it on purpose. It's just for whatever reason if you ever run a page, the setup actually makes less sense now than it used to. Like every time they redo it, it gets worse.
So, all right, everybody. Well, as always, thank you for tuning in, and keep in mind that we do have a Patreon that you can find over at MilwaukeeMafia.com. Click the Patreon link, and as always, you can also help us by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, and we will be back in 1 week with Patreon and in 2 weeks with a regular episode. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to the Milwaukee Mafia podcast. Join us next time for another look back at Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.